talking to somebody yesterday on the phone, and she thanked me for fighting for our community. I'm just glad that I was able to be a part of it.
The Georgia General Assembly is rapidly heading toward the last 72 hours of this year's 2025 legislative session. Today is Wednesday, April 2nd, 2025, and this edition of Political Update features myself, Tim Darnell, along with my good friend and colleague and co-worker here at Atlanta News First, Rick Folbaum. Rick, in this edition of Political Update, we initially thought we would be focusing pretty much all of our attention on the day of adjournment, which will be Friday, April 4th here in Atlanta at the state capitol as the General Assembly enters its final hectic 2 to 3 days or 72 hours, so to speak. But we also have a lot of other political news that I know we want to cover. But first of all, let's talk about the legislative adjournment. The southern pronunciation is Sine Die. Right. It is a Latin phrase. Heard a lot of different enunciations, whether it's Sine Die or some other iterations that I won't embarrass myself by trying to pronounce. But tell us what the last day of the legislative session is all about.
Well, Sine Die is actually one of the first things I had to look up when I first came to work here in Atlanta, because it's not a phrase that I had ever come across in all my years of reporting. But that said, it is the end, as you said, of the legislative session, and this is really sort of the mad dash to the finish line as both chambers of the State House try to get legislation passed and then sent over to the governor's desk for his signature so that these bills can become law this legislative session. Otherwise, they've got to wait until next year to try to reintroduce them. So there are a number of things that have passed, and we'll look and see if they're able to get any other legislation over the finish line between now and Friday night when Sine Die takes place and we see the lawmakers throw those pieces of paper up into the air.
It's always a celebratory scene on the floor of the State House and Senate when lawmakers adjourn. Our outstanding Georgia reporter Abby Kasuras has been down at the state capitol almost nonstop since the legislative session began in January. She has this package and this report on a couple of the measures that have been fast-tracked to Governor Brian Kemp's desk. We'll hear from Abby Kasuras, and then we'll be back in just a few seconds.
Right off the bat, looking over the agenda, 2 bills caught our eye. Priority bills for the heads of both of the chambers. Fast votes and quick transmittals, signaling we're nearing the end of session. And there are concerns about what can get over the finish line.
All in favor of the passage of the bill will vote yes.
Facing a vote, a highly controversial bill banning trans women from competing in girls' sports from kindergarten to college. Republican Representative Josh Bonner shared a story about a fight at his daughter's school.
That boy pretending to be a girl jumped my daughter's friend, put her on the ground, and beat her. It took 4 individuals to pull this boy off of my daughter's friend as he pounded her head. So don't tell me there is no advantage.
While Democrat after Democrat took to the well in opposition to the bill, Georgia Equality Director Jeff Graham watched as lawmakers voted to support the measure and immediately transmitted to the Senate. He says this bill is just a diversion from real issues.
When we could be talking about jobs, the economy, guaranteed access to health care, affordable housing, these are a lot of issues that got shoved to the side during this legislative session so that we could focus on who gets to play in sports.
Passage a priority for Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, who was leading a vote across the hall on the House Speaker's priority bill, the last of his school safety priorities, following the shooting in Appalachia High School.
I would ask you to please join with me and let's honor the deceased.
State Senator Bill Cowser seen tearing up in the well.
Senators ask for a moment of silence.
Christian Angulo, Mason Skirmerhorn, Christine Irami, and Richard Aspinwall.
After privacy concerns from parents, Cowser changed the language of the bill. He says the bill no longer creates a statewide database under GMA to track concerning students who may move schools. Members of the Winder community left disappointed.
We really need this passed. If we would have had this, a couple years ago, this could have been prevented.
Lawmakers with their backs against the wall. Friday is the critical Sine Die deadline. In Atlanta, I'm Abby Kasuras.
Rick, we have here in Georgia a 40-day legislative session, which, if you're only counting by weekdays, it's just over a month, perhaps a month and a half. And yet the legislature convenes in early January and adjourns in late March or early April. What are not all of the legislatives, not all legislative days at the state capitol are so-called working days or days in session. Why does a legislative session that only is supposed to last 40 days stretch out over more than 3 months?
Well, you're going to have to ask the lawmakers about all of that. But, I think that the bottom line here is that, in a state like ours, there is sort of a more conservative idea, a notion of what state lawmakers should and should not do, how much control they should have versus how much individual rights should take precedent, letting people live their lives the way that they want to live. And here in Georgia, there is a lot of that sentiment across the state. And so lawmakers try to create and pass legislation that addresses important topics while, really leaving a lot of other things just to the individual. So they don't like to infringe too much on people's individual rights. But as you said, there are a lot of pieces of legislation that have been prioritized and fast-tracked this legislative session. And what has stood out to me is how much it mirrors what we're seeing at the federal level. So many of the Republican state lawmakers here sort of taking their cue from the new Trump administration and tackling issues like transgender sports participation, a bill along those lines passing in the state legislature this session. Also other bills regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. We know that the Trump administration has taken a real hard line against those types of programs and that type of language being used in any kind of a setting where federal funds play a role. And we've also seen some legislation that was meant to address the terrible mass shooting at Appalachia High School last September. People still reeling from that, especially obviously in Barrow County and Winder, where the shooting took place. But lawmakers trying to come up, and John Burns, the speaker, really, sort of marshaling this effort to come up with a plan to make our schools safer here in the state, and I think also to make it easier if, God forbid, law enforcement has to respond to an active shooter situation at a school, that they now have the resources and the information and the technology that's needed to try to bring that situation under control and to a close as quickly as possible.
It's interesting you bring up the Appalachia High School shooting. The clip that we opened this edition of Political Update with here on Atlanta News First came from State Representative Holt Persinger. He is a lawmaker out of Winder and was a key supporter of one of House Speaker John Burns' school safety packages. Winder, of course, is the location of Appalachia High School where the terrible shooting took place. Give our readers and our viewers just some indication from an overall macro viewpoint, from your viewpoint as anchor here on Atlanta News First, of what we can expect over the next 72 hours at the state capitol.
Well, we're going to see a flurry of activity. The halls at the state capitol will be buzzing. Of course, there will be, you name it, any kind of lobbyists who will be front and center trying to push their agenda, working on behalf of their clients to get legislation that is more favorable to their interests passed during this legislative session. A lot of wheeling and dealing. You see also a lot of I don't want to use the word games, but it is sort of behind the scenes strategy to try to tack certain bills onto existing bills, to try to change the language of bills in order to insert other types of priorities on bills that are in the pipeline. So that's the kind of thing, this sort of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that lawmakers, especially the veteran lawmakers who've been there for a long time, know exactly how to pull those strings in order to get their priorities met. But it will be a very busy couple of days, and our reporters here at Atlanta News First who cover the State House certainly have their work cut out for them between now and Friday night.
Well, we'll be following their reports, as you can here on Atlanta News First and AtlantaNewsFirst.com. A couple of other developments that happened this week also has Georgia's political scenes buzzing. We'll talk about a couple of election-related lawsuits as we wrap up this edition of Political Update. But first, let's talk a little bit about what happened this past weekend when U.S. Congresswoman Nikema Williams, I should say, she represents the Atlanta Congressional District, District 5 on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. She has held that seat really since the late John Lewis passed away. John Lewis, a civil rights icon and giant, was held the District 5 seat in Congress in Georgia for several decades before passing away. Nikema Williams was elected to that seat in her own right and really has a good, strong, solid hold on it. But she resigned her position as chair of the Georgia Democratic Party this past weekend. Her resignation came after the state Democratic Party changed its bylaws to create a full-time paid position as chair of the GDP. Rick, Nikema Williams came under a lot of fire, a lot of criticism for her leadership in the, for Democrats at least, rather disastrous results here in Georgia at least of the 2024 presidential election that saw Donald Trump again recapture the state of Georgia and several other swing states across the nation. She came under a lot of criticism from U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff, who is an advocate of a much stronger party organization. What's your takeaway on this?
Well, it's very interesting, and you mentioned the rule change. There are, I think, certain efforts that are meant to save face, so that Congresswoman Williams doesn't seem as though she is stepping down in disgrace. She still holds her seat in Congress. She will be a member of the congressional delegation from Georgia, but she will not have this leadership position amongst Democrats here in the state of Georgia. And I think that the rule change was stated as the main reason that she was never intended to work that job full time, and that the rule change mandating full-time employee take over this position sort of made it a convenient way for her to step aside from that job, from that role, and allow people like Jon Ossoff to work behind the scenes and bring some of their, one of their favored candidates to the fore. Now, we don't know exactly who's taking over that position, but you mentioned Senator Ossoff. He is up for re-election in the midterm elections that are coming up, in less than 2 years. His seat is very much in play, and his popularity, even among Democrats in the state, has dropped if you take a look at his numbers. And so I think there is some concern on the part of Senator Ossoff and his team that they need to have somebody stronger in the position of leadership in terms of the Democratic Party here in Georgia, and that putting someone of their choosing in that position will help bolster Senator Ossoff's re-election chances next year.
You're talking about the 2026 midterms. One person who is not up for re-election is Governor Brian Kemp. He is constitutionally limited to, or prohibited, I should say, from seeking a third term as governor, meaning the 26 governor's race here in Georgia is wide open. One of the candidates who had been exploring a gubernatorial run is Congresswoman Lucy McBath out of Georgia's 6th congressional district, kind of in a northern metro Atlanta suburban district. She had formed an exploratory committee less than a month and a half ago. She announced this week she is suspending any potential gubernatorial bid because of her husband's health. Unfortunately, her husband has been recently diagnosed with cancer, obviously serious enough to where she feels like she cannot devote her full attention to perhaps running a gubernatorial campaign. Rick, this just cast an even greater cast of intrigue over the 26th governor's race, which is going to be just for all the political marbles here in less than 2 years.
That's right, and she did bring some star power when she announced the formation of her exploratory committee. Congresswoman McBath, we're talking about, but of course, making this difficult decision right now to step back from a potential run for the governor's office in order to take care of her husband is certainly something that I think everyone on both sides of the aisle can appreciate and sympathize with the family, and certainly send along their best wishes for a full and speedy recovery to the Congresswoman's husband. But you're right, her exiting the race, at least now, because I should say, she has not ruled out the possibility of re-entering the race should her husband's health take a turn for the better, and certainly we hope that that's the case with his health. But she hasn't completely shut the door to a run, but at least, at the very least, stepping back has begun a conversation as to who exactly is going to step up and become sort of a front runner here in this early race for the Democratic gubernatorial nomination here in Georgia. There are, of course, a bunch of names that have been mentioned. We'll see exactly how all of this plays out. Stacey Abrams has not entirely ruled out a third run, although I'm sure there are some Democrats here who would like to see somebody else take a turn after her two unsuccessful attempts, the last two go-arounds. So we'll see what happens. But again, Congresswoman McBath, a lot of times you hear we're talking about ways that lawmakers and people in the public eye try to save face. A lot of times you hear that so-and-so is leaving their position to spend more time with their family. That is sometimes the truth and sometimes not the truth. And in this particular case, with Lucy McBath's husband's recent cancer diagnosis, that does seem to be the case. And again, we wish him all the best.
We do indeed. And on the Republican side for Georgia's 26th governor's race, one of the rumored candidates, he has not announced. The only announced candidate so far is Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr. But also Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger has been rumored in some circles as perhaps considering a gubernatorial run. No word from the Secretary of State himself. But Secretary of State Raffensperger got some very good news earlier this week when two election-related lawsuits that pertain to Georgia's election process were dismissed. First of all, and both of these rulings came earlier this week on Monday, a lawsuit, the Trump administration, I should say, under the direction of President Donald Trump and his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, announced they are dismissing a lawsuit that was brought by President Joe Biden's Department of Justice administration, challenging Georgia's 2021 voting laws that the Democratic presidential administration had labeled as an effort to suppress the African American vote here in Georgia, and which then President Biden himself referred to as Jim Crow 2.0. That lawsuit has been dismissed now by the Justice Department. And also earlier this week, a U.S. District Court judge dismissed a lawsuit entitled Curling versus Raffensperger that was brought in 2017 in relation and as they relate to the accuracy of Georgia's electronic and paper ballot recording system. So between those and between the national recognition that Brad Raffensperger received, probably not so much of his choosing in his efforts to deny President Trump's request to find those several tens of thousands of votes in order for Donald Trump to carry Georgia in 2020. Brad Raffensperger is kind of riding a little bit of a wave of some pretty solid political successes.
You know, I think that he might be the dark horse in this race, even though you said you're right, he has not officially announced. It's no secret that he has had his eye on the governor's seat, and something that he has been thinking about and perhaps potentially planning for a run. We'll have to wait and see, but you're right. I mean, he certainly does have the wind at his sails here with these two lawsuits, which seem to vindicate quite clearly Secretary Raffensperger and his handling of elections here in the state of Georgia. Of course, that is really one of the primary jobs of the Secretary of State, is overseeing the state's elections, the carrying out and execution and counting during election season. And Secretary Raffensperger has really come out on the other side of these two lawsuits looking victorious, and in fact is victorious and able to stand up and say, hey, this is really just a vindication of what I've been saying all along, which is that Georgia's elections are free and fair. You can trust the results when they're announced here from the Secretary of State's office, and this is in spite of, as you said, the trouble within the Republican Party that he ran into back in 2020 when then President Trump, who were running for a second term that would be unsuccessful, really tried to put some pressure on Secretary Raffensperger and really damaged the Secretary's standing in the eyes of a lot of Republicans, especially those that are big supporters of President Trump and those who believed his claims that the election here in Georgia and elsewhere was rigged. I think that the other part of the equation, though, Tim, is that he may have angered some pro-Trump Republicans, but I think that he might have also gained the respect of some moderate Democrats, middle-of-the-road Democrats, people sort of in the political center who, may not typically vote for a Republican candidate, but who look at Senator Raffensperger as being a man of principle, someone who, stood by his principles and carried out his duties in the face of great political pressure. And I think that in the eyes of a lot of people, he gained a lot of standing and a lot of respect for the way that he conducted himself, both back in 2020 and again during this past election season in 2024. So we'll see. I think that if he does decide to officially jump in the race, he'll have support, and it might be bipartisan support. We'll have to wait and see.
That would be somewhat unusual in this era of extreme partisanship on all sides of the political spectrum. The past two presidential elections have been unlike any in recent history, and there's more drama and intrigue on the way, and we will continue to cover all of the latest political developments here in Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, and the nation here on Political Update. A reminder, you can watch Political Update and all of our podcasts, be it Decatur Dish, Behind the Investigation, Braves on Gray, or any other Atlanta News First podcast on our YouTube channel. You can also download Political Update and all of Atlanta News First podcasts on your favorite podcasting streaming platform, be it Amazon, Apple, Roku, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks to Rick Volbaum here in Atlanta News First, and thanks to all of you for watching and listening to this edition of Political Update on Atlanta News First.